closer to a healthier mind. So,
Is
Mr.
this
Mike,
about,
go ahead.
yeah, this is trauma as we're talking about mental health is never a solitary confinement. It's a ghost that haunts the spaces between us. In the laboratory of modern neuroscience, but we know that the amygdala doesn't just record events, it records the breaking of the bread of human trust. We experience what Bessel van der Kolk identifies as relational trauma. Our relational anthropology is shattered, leaving us in a state of chronic relational dysregulation. We become like the protagonists in the Temptations, I Wish It Would Rain, hiding our pain between a smile because the world feels unsafe. But as the ante-Nicene fathers and Augustine understood, the sovereign self cannot heal in isolation. We require a secure base, a sanctuary where the vagus nerve can find its haven. Healing is the act of moving from lonely longing into a covenantal community where, as Bill Withers sang in 1972, we finally have someone to lean on me.
To lean on me for
Hey.
sure. So, Mr. Mike, what does the modern neuroscience reveal about how trauma actually affects us, and why can't we simply think our way out of a traumatic responses?
Modern trauma science has arrived at a striking conclusion that would have surprised no one in the early church. The human person is not a self contained consciousness, but a relational being, formed in communion, wounded in relationship, and healed through love. What contemporary neuroscience calls co regulation and secure attachment, Christian theology has always called communion, caritas, and the restoration of right relationship. The convergence is not coincidental. Both disciplines, when pursued honestly, discover the same fundamental truth about human nature, that we are made for connection, that isolation wounds us at the deepest levels, and that healing requires the patient work of rebuilding trust through embodied presence. We explore how modern attachment theory and neuroplasticity research confirm what patristic and medieval Christian thinkers maintained about the nature of personhood, the mechanism of spiritual formation, and the practical path toward healing. Bessel van der Kolk's central insight in the body keeps the score represents a paradigm shift in how we understand psychological wounding. Trauma is not primarily a cognitive problem requiring better information, but a relational disruption that fundamentally reorganizes how the nervous system perceives safety, connection, and threat. Van der Kolk writes, trauma is not the story of something that happened back then, but the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people. This current imprint manifests somatically in racing hearts, frozen muscles, hypervigilant scanning, and the profound inability to rest in the presence of others. The neuroscience is clear and devastating. When trauma is interpersonal, abuse, neglect, betrayal, abandonment by those who should have provided safety, the brain doesn't simply restore a bad memory. Instead, the entire threat detection system recalibrates. The amygdala, that ancient alarm center deep in the limbic system, becomes hypersensitive. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational assessment and impulse controls, goes offline under stress. Most significantly, the neural pathways that should signal you are safe now fail to form or function properly. Van der Kolk notes, for real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. What makes interpersonal trauma uniquely damaging is that it attacks the very foundation of human development, the expectation that a relationship provides safety rather than danger. John Bowlby, the pioneer of attachment theory, demonstrated through decades of research that human infants are biologically wired to seek proximity to caregivers when distressed. The attachment system is not a psychological preference, it is a survival mechanism as fundamental as breathing. When the person who should provide safety becomes the source of threat, the developing brain faces an impossible bind. The child cannot flee. Survival depends on the caregiver, cannot fight. The caregiver is too powerful and cannot resolve through connection. The caregiver is the threat. The only option remaining is disassociation, a neurological splitting that allows the child to be not quite there during vulnerable and unbearable experiences. Van der Kolk describes this with clinical precision. Trauma produces actual physiological changes, including a recalibration of the brain's alarm system, an increase in stress hormone activity, and alterations in the system that filters relevant information from irrelevant. These are not metaphorical changes. They are measurable, observable alterations in brain structure and function. Neuroimaging studies show decreased activation in Broca's area, the region responsible for speech, when trauma survivors recall traumatic events, which explains why talking about it often feels impossible or unhelpful. The traumatized brain literally loses access to the language centers that would allow narrative processing of the experience. This is why traditional talk therapy, focused on insight and cognitive reframing, often fails with trauma survivors. As van der Kolk bluntly states, talk therapy can be beneficial, but it's not enough. The body needs to learn that the danger has passed. The traumatized nervous system requires something more fundamental than new information. It needs new experience. It needs repeated, predictable, safe encounters that contradict the learned expectation that relationships equals danger. The implications are profound. If trauma is fundamentally relational, if it occurs in the context of human connection and specifically damages the capacity for trust, safety, and attachment, then healing must also be relational. The traumatized brain cannot be convinced through argument that the world is safe. It must experience safety repeatedly and predictably until new neural pathways form. It must encounter what van der Kolk calls embodied safety, the felt sense registered in the body before it reaches conscious awareness that I am with someone who will not harm me. This embodied safety cannot be manufactured through technique or protocol. It emerges from the quality of presence offered by another human being. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory provides the neurobiological mechanism. Our nervous systems are constantly scanning the environment for cues of safety or danger through a process called neuroception. This happens below conscious awareness, before thought intervenes. The traumatized nervous system has learned to detect danger everywhere, particularly in the faces, voices, and proximity of other people. Healing requires what Porges calls co-regulation, the process by which one person's regulated nervous system helps to calm and organize another's dysregulated system. Van der Kolk summarizes the therapeutic implications. Being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Safety and safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives. For trauma survivors, this seemingly simple capacity to feel safe in the presence of another person represents the summit of healing. It requires the patient rebuilding of neural pathways that signal safety, the gradual restoration of trust that a relationship can be good, and the embodied relearning that vulnerability need not lead to violation. Crucially, van der Kolk emphasizes that his healing cannot be rushed. The brain changes slowly through repetition. He writes, neuroscience research shows that the only way we can change the way we feel is by becoming aware of our inner experience and learning to befriend what is going on inside ourselves. This befriending requires the consistent presence of others who can tolerate our dysregulation without becoming dysregulated themselves, who can remain present when we disassociate, and who can offer what attachment theorists call a secure base, a relationship stable enough to support the terrifying work of feeling again. Modern neuroscience reveals that trauma is not merely a psychological state requiring cognitive innovation, but a relational wound that reorganizes the nervous system's fundamental capacity to trust, connect, and rest. A wound that can only heal through a patient's embodied work of experiencing safety in relationship again. In conclusion, this points us directly toward a Christian understanding of healing through communion and love.
Communion and love. Definitely, yes. So, if trauma rewires the brain for fear and hypervigilance, is that the damage permanent, or can be brain actually changed even after severe wounding, Mr. Mac?
The discovery of neuroplasticity represents one of the most hopeful findings in modern neuroscience. The brain is not a fixed machine, but a living, adaptive organ capable of reorganization throughout the entire lifespan. This contradicts centuries of assumption that brain structure was essentially determined by early adulthood. As Norman Doidge writes in The Brain Can Change Itself, the brain is not an inanimate vessel that we fill, rather is more like a living creature with an appetite, one that can grow and change with it proper nourishment and exercise. This biological reality means that even severe trauma does not create permanent, irreversible damage. The brain shaped by fear can, through specific conditions and experiences, be reshaped for safety. The mechanism is both elegant and demanding. Neural pathways, the connection between brain cells that form patterns of response, strengthen with use and weaken with disuse. Neuroscientists summarize with the phrase neurons that fire together wire together. When a traumatized person repeatedly experiences the pattern of threat to survival response to relief, those neural pathways become increasingly automatic and sensitive. The threshold for activation lowers. Smaller triggers provoke larger responses. The brain becomes, in effect, a finely tuned threat detection system, brilliant at survival but incapable of rest. But the same principle works in reverse. When a person repeatedly experiences the pattern of vulnerability to safety to connection, new neural pathways form. Vander Kolk explains neuroscience research shows that the only way we can change the way we feel is by becoming aware of our inner experience and learning to befriend what is going on inside ourselves. This befriending happens through repeated experiences that contradict the traumatic learning. The amygdala can learn to quiet. The prefrontal cortex regain its capacity for assessment and modulation. The ventral vagal system, the part of the nervous system responsible for social engagement and calm, can come back online. Richard Davidson's research on neuroplasticity and emotional regulation provides compelling evidence. His studies demonstrate that practices promoting present moment awareness, compassionate attention, and emotional regulation produce measurable changes in brain structure within 8 weeks. The prefrontal cortex thickens. The amygdala shows reduced reactivity. Most significantly, the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala strengthens, meaning the executive centers gain greater capacity to modulate emotional responses. Davidson notes, based on what we know of the plasticity of the brain, we can think of things like happiness and compassion as skills that can be trained. The clinical implications are revolutionary. Pat Ogden's sensomotor psychotherapy, Peter Levine's somatic experiences, and Werder Kolk's own trauma sensitive yoga all leverage neuroplasticity by providing repeated experiences of safety, agency, and successful self regulation. These approaches recognize that healing trauma requires more than insight, it requires the formation of new somatic habits. The body must learn through repetition that arousal can return to baseline. Vulnerability need not lead to violation. Relationship can provide regulation rather than dysregulation. The present moment is distinct from the traumatic past. Vander Kolk emphasizes this repeatedly. The brain is built to change in response to experience, and healing requires new experiences, not just new insights. This is not metaphorical language. Neuroimaging studies show that effective trauma treatment produces visible changes in brain activation patterns. The regions associated with self awareness and executive function become more active. The regions associated with threat detection and survival responses become less dominant. The brain literally reorganizes itself in response to consistent, repeated experiences of safety and attunement. Luis Consolino's work on the neuroscience of psychotherapy provides the theoretical framework for understanding how this happens in a therapeutic relationship. He writes, the social brain is built through interactions with caring others throughout life. Early attachment relationships create an internal template for all later relationships and become a central component of our neurobiological infrastructure. When early attachment relationships are characterized by neglect, abuse, or profound inconsistency, that neurobiological infrastructure becomes organized around survival rather than connection. But because the brain remains plastic, New relationships, particularly therapeutic relationships characterized by consistent attunement, safety, and what Daniel Siegel calls cognitive contingent communication, can build new templates. Siegel's concept of integration captures the goal of neuroplastic healing. Integration means the brain's various systems, emotional, cognitive, somatic, relational, can work together rather than operating in isolated, conflicting patterns. The traumatized brain is characterized by fragmentation. The thinking self cannot calm the emotional self. The body's alarm signals override rational assessment. Memories intrude without context or containment. Healing means developing what Siegel calls horizontal integration between left and right hemispheres, vertical integration between cortical and subcortical regions, and interpersonal integration between self and others. This integration happens slowly. Neuroplasticity is not magic, it is biology, and biology operates on biological timescales. The sheaths that insulate neural pathways and allow rapid signal transmission take months or years to develop. The branching that increases neural connectivity requires consistent stimulation over extended periods. As Deutsch wrote, plastic change requires that neurons fire repeatedly, thousands of times at the same time. If they do, they will maintain or strengthen their connections. This means healing trauma requires sustained engagement with safety, not brief exposure. It requires relationships that persist through dysregulation, not therapeutic techniques applied in isolation. The research on critical periods and sensitive periods adds nuance to our understanding. While the brain remains plastic throughout life, there are developmental windows when certain types of learning occur more readily. Early childhood represents a sensitive period for attachment learning, the time when the brain is particularly primed to encode patterns of relationship. Trauma during these sensitive periods produces especially deep effects because it shapes the foundational architecture on which later development builds. But even here, the news is hopeful, which may be easier to learn secure attachment in infancy. The capacity to form new attachment patterns persists into adulthood. The brain of a 40-year-old trauma survivor can still learn safety, though it may require more repetition and more explicit support than it would have in childhood. Alan Shore's work on affect regulation and the development of the right hemisphere provides crucial detail about how this works. The right hemisphere, dominant in processing emotion, attachment, and bodily states, develops primarily through face to face interaction with attuned caregivers. When these interactions are consistently misattuned, when the caregiver is frightening, absent, or overwhelming, the right hemisphere develops patterns of dysregulation. But Shore's research demonstrates that these patterns remain modifiable through subsequent relationships characterized by what he calls interactive repair, the process of moving from dysregulation through attunement back to regulation, repeatedly and reliably. The science of neuroplasticity confirms that the brain wounded by trauma retains the capacity for reorganization through life, not through willpower or positive thinking, but through sustained, repeated experiences of embodied safety and attuned relationship that gradually build new neural pathways capable of trust, connection, and rest. In conclusion, these findings suggest that Christian practices of formation, repetition, and patient accompaniment align precisely with the neurobiological mechanisms of healing.
Mr. Manick, how did early Christian thinkers understand the human person, and does Augustine's ancient psychology actually map onto what modern trauma science describes?
Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, would have been utterly unsurprised by van der Kolk's findings, not because Augustine had access to MRI machines or attachment theory, but because he understood something fundamental. The human person is not primarily a rational calculator, but a desiring, loving being whose fundamental orientation shapes everything else. In his treatise on Christian doctrine, Augustine writes, "My weight is my love. Wherever I am carried, my love is carrying me." That is not a poetic metaphor, it's a psychological description. For Augustine, what we love determines what we become. Trauma, in Augustinian terms, is a profound disorder of love. The wounded person learns to love the wrong things in the wrong ways: control instead of trust, isolation instead of communion, self-protection instead of vulnerability. This is not a moral failure. It's a survival adaptation that becomes an ingrained pattern. Augustine's famous phrase, literally curved inward on itself, describes the traumatized posture with remarkable precision. The self that should extend outward toward God and neighbor instead collapses inward, circles back on itself, and creates what we now might call a closed system of defensive self sufficiency. In Confessions, Augustine traces his own journey through this curvature. Book two's analysis of the pear stealing incident reveals Augustine's insight that sin is not primarily about breaking rules, but about a disordered relationship. He writes, I love my fall, not for the object for which I had fallen, but my fall itself. My soul was corrupt and hurled itself down from security in you into utter destruction. The language of falling, hurling, destruction, this describes disassociation, the traumatized self's departure from a secure relationship into isolated survival mode. Augustine's understanding of memory further aligns with modern trauma science. In Book 10 of Confessions, he describes memory not as neural storage, but as a living landscape where experience shapes present perception. Great is this power of memory, exceedingly great, O my God, a large and boundless inner hall. Who has plumbed the depths thereof? Traumatic memory, as van der Kolk describes it, intrudes into the present precisely because it lacks the temporal markers that would consign it to the past. Augustine understood that memory shapes desire, desire shapes action, and action forms habit, what medieval philosophers would later call habitus. The traumatized person is trapped in patterns of habitual response formed by past wounding, patterns that persist even when circumstances change. The key insight Augustine offers is that healing cannot be achieved through willpower alone. In Confessions 8, he describes his agony in the garden. The mind commands the body and is instantly obeyed. The mind commands itself and meets resistance. This is precisely what trauma survivors experience. The conscious self wants to trust, to rest, to connect, but the body refuses. The amygdala overrides the prefrontal cortex. The survival systems ignore rational intention. Augustine's solution, radical for his time and still radical today, is that healing requires grace, not as magical intervention, but as the actual presence of trustworthy love that can reorder disordered desire through relationship. Augustine's City of God develops this relational anthropology further. He contrasts two cities, two fundamental orientations, love of self to contempt of God versus love of God to contempt of self. But contempt of self doesn't mean self-hatred. It means the capacity to decenter, to exist in relation rather than the defensive self-enclosure. The traumatized person cannot make this move alone because trauma has taught that decentering leads to annihilation. Only the consistent experience of love that doesn't abandon, presence that doesn't violate, can gradually convince the wounded system that it's safe to open again. In his sermons on the Psalms, Augustine repeatedly returns to the theme of crying out to God from distress. Psalm 31 becomes a meditation on trauma. I am forgotten as though I were dead. I have become like broken pottery. Augustine comments, when we are broken, we cry out, and it is good that we are broken, if thereby we learn to cry out to the one who alone can make us whole. This is not a platitude, it's a clinical observation. The traumatized person often cannot cry out. The capacity for vulnerable appeal has been damaged. Healing begins when a safe relationship makes crying out possible again. Augustine's concept of caritas, ordered love, provides the theological framework for understanding attachment. John Bowlby's attachment theory describes how infants develop internal working models of relationships based on caregiver responsiveness. Augustine would translate this. We learn what to expect from love based on what love has shown us. When early love is cruel or absent, we develop working models organized around fear. Augustine writes in On the Trinity, if you see charity, you see the Trinity. Healthy attachment, secure, mutual, life-giving, images the Trinitarian life. Disordered attachment images the fall. The medieval development of Augustine's psychology, particularly in Bernard of Clairvaux and the Victorian school, makes the therapeutic implications explicit. Bernard's On Loving God describes four stages of love: loving self for self's sake, loving God for self's sake, loving God for God's sake, and loving self for God's sake. This isn't moral progression. It's a description of healing from self-protective isolation towards a secure relationship. The traumatized person is stuck in stage one, unable to trust enough to move forward toward the vulnerability stages two and through four require. Bernard writes, the reason for loving God is God himself, and the measure of love due to him is immeasurable love. But this immeasurable love can only be received and therefore returned by someone whose capacity to receive hasn't been destroyed by violation. Augustine's influence on Christian spiritual formation creates a tradition that understands healing as slow, embodied relational work. The Augustinian emphasis on liturgy, repetition, and communal practice recognizes what neuroscience now confirms. Habits change through repeated action in a supportive context, not through insight alone. The divine offices cycle of prayer, the Eucharist, rhythm, the practices of confession and reconciliation, these create what we now might call co-regulation opportunities, moments when the dysregulated self can synchronize with a larger, safer rhythm. In On True Religion, Augustine makes an observation that could serve as a motto for trauma-informed therapy. Do not go outward, return within yourself. In the inward man dwells truth, but he immediately adds a crucial caveat. This inward truth is found only by moving through and beyond the self toward God. The traumatized inward turn must be distinguished from healthy interiority. Trauma creates a defensive inwardness that cannot escape itself. Healing creates a secure inwardness that can move outward again toward communion. Augustine understood that this transformation requires sustained encounter with love that proves stronger than fear, which is precisely what attachment theory described as earned, secure attachment. Augustine's psychology of disordered love, his description of the self curved inward on itself, and his insistence that healing requires the reordering of desire through encounter with trustworthy love all map precisely onto modern attachment theory and trauma science. Think of what you listen to when you hear the lens of the Staple Brothers, Staple Sisters, I'll Take You There. It's a song about a place where ain't nobody crying and no smiling faces lying to the races. That song is a musical, secure base, a promise of a relational reality where the laboratory of the world is replaced by the sanctuary of peace. In conclusion, these findings suggest that the Christian tradition has always understood what neuroscience is now discovering about the relational nature of human formation and the relational path toward healing.
Very well said, Mr. Mink. Very well said. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom today. Neuroscience now maps how early and repeated experiences wire expectations. The brain predicts whether others are safe. The body prepares for protections or openness before conscious thoughts rise. Trust lowers stress activation. Rejection heightens vigilance. Consistency builds regulation. Now, Mr. Mick, would you like to plug in something?
I appreciate the opportunity. Write the book, grow the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn. GMIC, the Dr. Digital Smith, PhD. Listen to the Dr. Digital podcast and pick up a couple volumes I have on Amazon. Burning America and On Track, Ian Hunter.
Yes, people, let's go to Mr. Mick, the Dr. Digital, and please do listen to our other podcasts, Music 101, Sex 101, and Mental Health 101, and what else? Mr. Mike?
Love letters.
Love letters.
Love letters.
Yes, please do listen wherever you listen to your podcasts. So, Mr. Mike, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Until next time, stay as full.
Might come, people. See you soon.